Hey everyone, June Williams here, and we are going to be considering the topic of self-compassion in today's video and considering how it functions and what are some of the impacts when we have enough of it, as well as when we don't have enough of this component that we'll be discovering together. So let me jump into the overview here. We'll be talking about what is this thing, self-compassion. You've probably heard of compassion, but might not have heard of the idea of turning that compassion towards your own self and what that can do for you. I want to consider together what it is not. A lot of people have really natural and healthy fears of what self-compassion is and how it could take them off course, but I want to talk to you about what it is not, as well as how to develop more of it if it seems like you're under-resourced as far as this goes. So let's talk about self-compassion. So it's a construct drawn from Buddhist psychology and comes in the way of how one relates to their own self. The way that you relate to yourself through the lens of self-compassion is with kindness, being gentle, supportive, understanding. The self and inside your own self is offered this sense of warmth and connection, as well as unconditional acceptance, meaning that the support, the gentle response, the kindness, the generosity that's offered is with no strings attached. It doesn't come from one feeling as if they deserve this kindness and acceptance. This comes from the innate sense that humans deserve unconditional acceptance. And so with self-compassion, we turn all of that, all of those traits, all of those value sets towards our own self, and we will kind of consider together what is it that we gain from turning towards ourselves with kindness, with gentleness, and what is it that we see as some of the outcomes that we can determine that come from a lack of self-compassion and a lack of this gentleness in responding to our own selves. So let's consider the question, why do we need self-compassion? The Dalai Lama says this: if you don't love yourself, you cannot love others. You will not be able to love others. If you have no compassion for yourself, then you are not able to develop compassion for others. And so, of course, we want to consider what are some of the benefits of self-compassion as far as what you may gain personally. But at base, let's consider that you can't love others. This means you can't love your partner, you can't love your children, you can't love your aging parents, you can't love your coworkers, you can't love even your dog if you are unable to connect to and love your own self. Your ability to be self-compassionate and self-loving is the fuel source that you will need to return back to when other people are difficult and when other people are being humans, drawing on the well of your own self-compassion, and the nourishment that you've received from that is going to be so incredibly important. If you don't love yourself, you cannot love others. So let's consider then, what does self-compassion provide to us? Research shows a lot of things. We have just kind of begun to dip our toe in the water of what kind of outcomes can we see with increased self-compassion. But first, let's consider balanced relationships, meaning that the level of, if we are in kind of self-criticism and we're extending a good amount of doting and care towards the other, toward our partner, we could see how easily we would run out of gas and that relationship would become imbalanced quickly. So self-compassion allows us to be in balanced relationship. Research shows healthier self-esteem as well as resilience, less anxiety, less depression, less shame and fear of failure. Our willingness to make mistakes really goes up when we have self-compassion. and we have less dependency on others to validate our own self-worth because we are capable of handling our own mistakes and our own failures. So what happens without it? Mark Victor Hansen says, lack of forgiveness causes almost all of our self-sabotaging behavior. We can consider in this lack of forgiveness, meaning lack of forgiveness towards our own self for our own humanity, will so likely increase sabotaging behavior. And like we just have considered so far in the program, how much sabotage can creep in when progress and growth are trying to occur. So if you look at it through that lens, you can see how self-compassion, your willingness to give yourself permission to be a human and to forgive yourself for the ways in which you have been a human, missed the mark, made mistakes, your willingness to do this is going to support your stamina and decrease the self-sabotaging behavior that's really normal in relationships. So what is it not? A lot of people are very afraid of these things listed here, that self-compassion would make them conceited and arrogant, but it's important to know that self-compassion is not arrogance, it's not conceit, it's not a lack of responsibility, and it's not self-indulgence. When we look at self-compassion, what we're considering is that we grasp intentionally that the way in which we've just made a mistake is a reflection of the fact that we are human. Now, we must always couple that with self-responsibility in order to make amends and find a new way to attend to the project we were just working on. So it's not a lack of responsibility, but self-compassion actually shortens the turnaround time for us to be able to re-engage back in the task if we're not spending all of that time in self-hatred. Dr. Kristen Neff is a forerunning research scientist on this topic of self-compassion, and she says, the biggest reason people aren't more self-compassionate is that they are afraid they'll become self-indulgent. They believe self-criticism is what keeps them in line. They imagine that beating themselves up is what keeps them productive and efficient. One thing that we've begun to understand from self-compassion is that we are much more capable of making amends if we have not damaged our own self in the process of kind of finding that self-correction that we needed. It's important to know, though, that self-criticism plays an incredible role in keeping us on track. How can we make that a little bit more productive and keep it from damaging and destroying our sense of self? So I want to talk to you about how you can develop more, and then I want to talk to you about how do you manage self-criticism. So how do you develop more self-compassion? First, it's so simple and it's so profound. Talk to yourself the way you would a friend. If a friend was struggling with what you're struggling with, how would you talk to them? If a small child was struggling with some of the feelings you're struggling with, how would you attend to them? If your pet was having a hard time and feeling overwhelmed with something, how would you talk to them? I want you to consider practicing mindfulness, which we'll discuss in a moment, and how is it that you can stay out of over-identifying with the feeling. Over-identifying would be that instead of saying, I feel angry, one might say, I am angry, meaning that personified as a human, I'm an angry person. It's important to attempt to say that I feel angry so that you can get a little bit of distance from that feeling and not sensing that the feeling that you're experiencing is a reflection of who you are and how you comport yourself in this world. Right, so in this attempt to develop more self-compassion, I want to encourage you to tend toward yourself the way you would a friend, a small child, a pet, something gentle, something that needed nourishment, as well as practicing mindfulness and getting a little bit of distance from the thoughts and the feelings that you're having. I want to dig in a little bit to this mindfulness with your inner critic. So often we will have an all or nothing kind of type of thinking in an approach to an inner critic, meaning that we will either completely listen to it, totally embrace it, jump on board, or we will try to completely silence it. The goal here is middle road, and practicing mindfulness with this inner critic. So this voice, this critical inner voice that pops up and criticizes and judges you at times, I want you to first attempt to listen to what that critical inner voice is saying without trying to change it or anything like that. Just try to listen, to understand. Maybe ask it, what or who are you protecting me from? What are you afraid will happen if you don't criticize me? How did it, in the end, motivate you or even comfort you? Did it help get you out of a snag? Did it help support you and make you feel better, make you feel like you were a victim, and that made you feel a little bit more validated? So the first goal here is to listen to it, understand what it's coming from, and finding some understanding as well as some compassion for the critical voice, trusting that these kind of parts that pop up to try to protect us tend to have good intentions. They go a little bit off course sometimes, but when we work to understand their good intentions, the critic, the edge to it tends to soften a bit. So the idea is to listen to the inner critic, understand what it is that's fueling that voice, and then allow it to rest, letting that part of you know that you have heard the concerns and that they are important to you and that you appreciate that coming up. Then you can shift into recognizing and accepting your humanity. So the combination between listening to your inner critic, letting it know that you hear it, as well as supporting the view that it's okay to be human. Here's this great quote I want to read you. I want you to make room for your humanity. Self-compassion is about giving ourselves room to be human, to be flawed and sensitive, lazy and unproductive, without having to define ourselves by those flashes of feelings and ways of being. It's about cultivating a perspective over ourselves so we never shut ourselves down and never lose faith in our own potential, just because we may fly off the deep end one night or hole up in our apartment all weekend. Chelsea Lee Trescott said this, and she's a relationship coach. And so I think that it's important to consider that we make room both for our critic as well as our humanity. If we try to shut either of those down, we don't tend to do well. So I want to leave you at the end of this video with one more concept in making room for your own humanity. I often see people have a couple of different perspectives. They are either superhuman or they are subhuman. So they have superhuman expectations of themselves, and when they miss it in the slightest way, then they flop down into subhuman, worthless, defeated, victim, what have you. And so that vacillation between all or nothing, superhuman and subhuman, leaves out this huge category right in the middle, which we can just call just human. And that should be the category that takes up all the space and the recognition of the ways in which we are flawed and we make mistakes. And that is what makes us connected to all the humanity around us. It's the one thing that connects us all, is that we are flawed. And so if you find yourself vacillating between high expectations and low self-esteem, really big positive picture and feeling totally defeated, you might be stuck in the superhuman, subhuman process. And I want to give you permission for the middle road to be just human. So here we are, arriving at the end of the self-compassion video. I hope that spending some time steeping in this thought gives you a little bit of room for your own humanity, and we will see how that ends up playing out in your relationship. I will see you in the next video.